everyone, and thank you for tuning in. So the Yamaha Tenere 700, I've owned mine for the past few months and have had time to put some pretty good miles on it and do some pretty fun trips with it. As some of you know, last year I owned KTM 790 Adventure R and I ended up selling it to my riding buddy and one of my best friends. A lot of people have asked me to compare and contrast both bikes and kind of talk about the differences between them and why I switched from one to the other. So today that's just what we're going to do. I'm going to share my experience of riding these bikes both on and off road, working on them, wrenching on them, the ownership experience, and we'll try to talk about reliability as well. We're going to look at the specs, but more importantly, we're going to talk about those nuanced differences between them, how it actually is to own and ride both bikes. This is what you've all been asking for, so let's go ahead and jump right in and get started. So first of all, I know you're going to ask me, why did I sell the 790 Adventure R if I loved it so much? Well, honestly, it really had nothing to do with the motorcycle. I was at a point in my life where I had some things going on personally, and I just needed to take a break from riding. So I took a pretty long break from riding, and I ended up selling the 790 to Brandon, one of my best friends, and someone who I've been riding with my whole life. The great part about that is I still get to see it, I still get to ride it, and I still get to keep track of kind of how it's doing as it starts to rack up some more miles. The second thing you're going to ask is what made me buy Yamaha Tenere 700. So as I started to get back into riding earlier this year, I realized I needed like a middleweight adventure bike, something smaller than my 1250 GS Adventure. The Tenere 700 had a great reputation, everybody was having really glowing reviews of it, and it fits my riding style. It's a good middleweight bike that can kind of do a little bit of everything. One of my best friends, Jesse, who goes by Moto ADV on Instagram, he had this bike and he had it really well set up, and he went crazy one day and decided to sell it, so he sent me a text message and I was down to the same day with the trailer and the money and picked it up and brought it home. So before I go any further, I'm going to refer both to the 790 and the 890 in this video. You have to remember that the 890 was an update. Basically, they added a larger engine, they made it Euro 5 compliant, it got about 10% more power and torque, but in many ways, and in many of the ways we're going to discuss the performance, the bikes ride, handle, and are very, very similar motorcycles with the same design, which is a slight bump in displacement, power, and torque on the 890. So while the T7 and the 790 and 890 are very popular in the midsize adventure category, there are more and more choices all the time. Right now we've got the Tiger 900 Rally Pro, we've got BMW's FA50 GS, we've got the Moto Guzzi V85 TT, and coming pretty soon we've got things like the Aprilia Touareg 660, Ducati Desert X, and Husky's Norden 901, which is basically a reskinned KTM 890. So it's an amazing time to be an adventure rider with all these choices out there, but for this video I'm just talking about the T7 and the 790, 890 because I've owned both and I just need to focus on something for this video. So let's dive into the specs and get this out of the way first because there's actually a lot of important things revealed by looking at the specs side by side here. Now, it wouldn't be fair to do this without also looking at the standard 890. So KTM sells a standard 890 and then the 890R. The 890R is basically the off-road performance version. It has a higher, taller suspension, taller seat height, and a few more features. If you really want to compare the Tenere 700, it actually compares a little bit more in terms of price and suspension and everything to the standard 890 than the 890R, but we'll go ahead and list all three. So let's cover the pricing first. So pricing is a big deal. It matters to people. If you can't afford it, then you can't afford it, right? So the T7 comes in at $9,999 US, which is really a great bargain for a bike of any kind, but especially a mid-size adventure bike. The standard 890 will run you just over $13,000 US, and the 890R is $14,200 US dollars. Let's talk about weight. Everybody likes to talk about the weight of adventure bikes. The T7 comes in around 450 pounds wet. The 890s come in around 470 pounds wet. Wet meaning full of fuel, they've got the battery, all the fluids ready to ride, but with no accessories bolted on. So you're thinking, well, the KTM is 20 pounds heavier, but it's not exactly that simple because the KTM holds a gallon more fuel, which gives you additional riding range, and that gallon of fuel counts for around 7 pounds or so. The other thing is, we'll talk about this later, but most Tenere 700s are going to need crash bars, which adds quite a bit of weight, and the 790, 890 platform doesn't need crash bars because it has the tank that protects the engine. Let's talk about power and torque between these two bikes, and that's really one of the huge things that separates them. So the Yamaha is around 72 horsepower and 50 foot-pounds of torque, or 53 kilowatts and 58 newton meters. The KTM 890, which is a pretty big bump from the 790, is 104 horsepower and 73 foot-pounds of torque. That's about 76 kilowatts and 100 newton meters of torque. So that's a big increase from the 700, and it should be. It's a much larger engine, it's a more expensive bike. Let's talk about the compression ratio. So why would I list something like that here? Well, I don't think enough motorcycle reviews talk about this. The reason the compression ratio is important is because it affects how much power the engine's going to make, but it also affects longevity and durability. So the higher compression ratio is typically an engine with more stress put on it, it's being pushed harder, and all things being equal, an engine with higher compression may not last as long and prove as durable as an engine with lower compression. The other thing to note is that when you have a high compression engine like the 790s and 890s, you're going to need to run premium fuel. And in some areas of the world, if you're traveling the world in some areas, you're not going to be able to always get premium fuel. But the Yamaha, the T7, because it's only 11.5 to 1 compression ratio, as opposed to 13.5 to 1 on the KTM, you'll be able to put regular fuel in it, which is going to be better for people traveling in remote parts of the world. I mentioned the fuel capacity before. So on the Yamaha, you've got 4.2 gallons, or about 16 liters. On the KTM, you've got a whole nother gallon, 5.3 gallons, or about 20 liters. So riding range is much better on the KTM because they get pretty similar mileage. Let's look at the ground clearance and the suspension travel. So on the T7, you've got 9.4 inches of ground clearance, which is really good, really competitive, or about 240 millimeters. And suspension travel on that bike is around 8.3 inches, or about 210 millimeters. So the standard 890, which is more comparable to the Tenere in terms of its size and its height, it's got similar ground clearance to the T7 and similar suspension travel there at about 8 inches. Now, if you look at the 890R, that's when things get more interesting because you go up to 10.4 inches of ground clearance and 9.5 inches of suspension travel. So that increased ground clearance is going to be better for clearing rocks and logs and obstacles on the trail. You're going to get hung up less. And the increased suspension travel allows for a more plush, more controlled ride off-road. However, those things we just talked about are tied to seat height. Now, why does seat height matter? Well, it matters to most of you out there because unless you're over 6 feet tall, all of these adventure bikes are very tall motorcycles. It can be very intimidating, even getting on and off on the street, not even to mention difficult off-road terrain. So the T7 uses a pretty average seat height in the adventure world of around 34.5 inches or 880 millimeters. If you look at the standard 890, it's actually a pretty good option for shorter people because it's only 33.5 inches and it's standard height, or if you put the seat in low position, it's 32.7 inches or down to 830 mils. Now on the 890R, you're looking at comparable seat height to the Yamaha T7 there at about 34.5 inches. Again, that's with the standard seat. I know they sell a low seat, they sell a rally seat, but we're just talking about the standard seat. So if you're a vertically challenged rider, you might want to look at that 890 with that lower seat in low position. That's going to be a lot more friendly for you than either of these other two bikes here. The dashboard, that's pretty obvious. The Yamaha uses the basic LCD dashboard, whereas the KTM, you've got a lot more going on there with the full color TFT. Let's talk about some of the technology. So cruise control, quick shifter. Neither of those things are available from Yamaha with the Tenere 700. I hope someday that they release a version that would be awesome. But if you want those things, you're going to have to go to the 890. They are available on the 890s as an optional extra for a little bit more money. IMU is an inertial measurement unit, and it measures the pitch angle and all the acceleration forces on the motorcycle and helps the ABS and the traction control provide a safer, smoother riding experience, basically, right? The T7 doesn't have any of that. The 890s do have that, and so you get much more sophisticated electronic control. Tied to all this, of course, is riding modes. Obviously, the Tenere 700 just has one riding mode, which is just fun. The 890s have different riding modes, rain, street, off-road. You can configure it. It's really great. But if you don't care about that, then you will like the T7 because you don't have to worry about it. Another thing that some of the reviews don't talk about is the difference in the wheels. So while they're both a 21-inch and 18-inch rear, which is great for off-road tire sizing, the KTMs use tubeless technology on their rims, and the Tenere 700 does not. Now, without going into a huge debate about this, because there's a lot of opinions about which is better, typically more street and touring-oriented bikes are going to have tubeless rims because you can just put a plug in the tire. If you have a little nail or a screw, you can plug it and go on your way. But if you have a tube, to repair a puncture is much more involved because you're going to have to take the wheel off the motorcycle, break one bead off, break that off, take the tube out, fix the tube. It's a lot more involved. However, a lot of more serious dedicated off-road riders prefer the tube type tire simply because of this. If you have a major failure with a tubeless tire, like a cut that you can't repair with a plug, how are you going to reseat that bead without having access to really high amount of air pressure from like a compressor, right, that you might have in your shop? So that can be challenging to do on the trail, whereas with a tube, you can always stick a tube in it, and even if you can only inflate it to 15 psi, you're still going to be able to get back home even if you can't fully seat that bead on. But you can't do that with a tubeless tire because you've got to be able to pop that bead on to provide an air seal. So that can be pretty tricky if you have tubeless. Okay, so I know getting through those specs, that was a lot of information, that was a little bit dense to unpack all that, so I apologize. So let's move on and talk about what you actually notice when you get on and ride these bikes back to back. So what's the different experience? One of the things you're going to notice about the Tenere 700 is that it has a very tall engine. I've actually measured this. So the engine is really, really tall. And what it does is it pushes the whole weight of the motorcycle up pretty high. So what they have to do is, because it's a conventionally designed motorcycle, it has the gas tank up above the engine sitting on top of it. So it pushes the gas tank higher. So if you actually measure, which I have done, because I have a lot of bikes that come through for testing, if you measure from the ground to the top of the gas tank, it's actually really, really high. And I've been trying to figure out, how to measure this, because the Tenere 700, as I've shown in some of my videos and as a lot of other people have talked about, it feels pretty top heavy for a relatively lightweight motorcycle. And in fact, it is top heavy. The engine sits high, the gas tank sits high. How does this compare to the 790 and the 890? Well, it's a very important point of comparison, because probably the largest advantage, besides being more powerful and having the tech, that the 790s and the 890s have is that they use that saddle style fuel tank, which keeps the fuel down low. So even if the engine is just as high as the Tenere, which I haven't measured, but I think it's pretty similar, they're able to put that fuel down low, and they're able to keep the weight of the bike low. What this means for you is that when you get on the bike, you immediately notice it doesn't feel top heavy. It's easy to pick up off the side stand, and also when you drop these bikes, the 790 is much, much easier to pick up than the Tenere 700. And if you want to go watch my video about how I rate bikes, picking them up, the difficulty, I link that video here. The other nice thing about that saddle style fuel tank of the 790 and 890 is that you don't need engine crash bars. That is designed to protect the engine from damage from dropping it or crashing stuff on the trail. The 700, you're going to have to add 15 pounds or so of crash bar protection, which has negated all your weight advantage by having that lighter bike, because you're going to need crash bars if you want to ride off-road. So other than the Tenere 700 actually feeling a bit heavier in use, they feel about the same size. Like when you're riding it, they have the same seat height unless you're looking at the 890 with the lower seat. So when you jump on these bikes to ride, what are the first differences that you notice? The first thing is when you get on a T7, you notice how slim the whole motorcycle is. You also notice how simple the display is. So you've just got that LCD with just a couple of buttons. When you jump on the KTM, you kind of see this wide fuel tank down beneath you, which is kind of something to get used to. And you also have this big colorful TFT and a lot more buttons going on the handlebar. So you have more tech to deal with, which could be good or bad depending on your perspective. What about when you start the bikes up and getting ready to ride? So one of the things that I don't love about the KTMs is because of the way the engine's designed, and I talked about the higher compression ratio, they just don't have a very refined engine sound. It kind of feels like a little bit like bolts going around in a blender. It's not really a pleasing refined sound. On the other hand, when you start up a Tenere 700, whether you have a stock exhaust or an aftermarket exhaust like I do, they sound very, very precise, very smooth, and just very refined by comparison. It just gives you a little bit better feeling that, it doesn't sound like a box of rocks. Let's talk about riding on the highway, riding on the street, whether it's twisties or freeway or whatever. So the KTM is way faster in all situations, period. It just is. There's just no way around it. It's a more powerful motorcycle. The KTM is eager. The engine wants to rev, it wants to push, it wants to go fast, and it feels almost as powerful and fast as a 1200 class adventure bike like my GS. The brakes on the KTM are also stronger. They have more power, they have better feel. Although the Tenere 700 brakes are fine, they have good stopping power, but it takes a lot more lever pull to get that. Some people will prefer the grabbier brakes of the KTM, and some people will prefer the more progressive feel of the T7. It just depends on your personal taste. What about handling on the street? Well, the KTM wins hands down. It just does. The KTM, because it's got that low center of gravity, is more flickable, it's more nimble, it feels lighter, it feels smaller, and when you want to push on the pavement, push the pace, it feels much more balanced and much more fun to ride. Another thing for street riding or highway riding is wind protection. And if you've seen some of my videos from last year, you know I had a lot of issues with buffeting and wind noise on the 790 and 890. And that's true, and a lot of people report that. You can fix that for the most part by taking off those little side winglets and putting on some sort of a spoiler or changing the windshield. By comparison, the Tenere 700, it does have wind buffeting. It's not really what I would say is a quiet bike, but it doesn't have the blast and the total shaking of the helmet that the 790 does out of the showroom. So that's something you're going to notice. The 790 does have an adjustable windshield with 2 positions, but you have to get off and remove bolts to do it. The Tenere 700 does not have an adjustable windshield from the factory. Off-road riding, so that's what a lot of you want to know about, right? So how do they handle off-road? And this is much more difficult to talk about. It's kind of more of a mixed bag here. The Tenere 700, it feels stable, it feels predictable, and it feels like maybe a slightly smaller motorcycle, although not necessarily lighter, if you know what I mean. However, where the Tenere 700 really falls down compared to the KTM is in the suspension. So here's what I mean. The suspension on the Tenere 700 is pretty budget. And I'm not saying that as a bad thing, because the Tenere 700 is a budget bike and it's a great price, so you don't expect to get top shelf componentry. But here's what it means when you're riding. The KTM, because it has better valving and more travel and just a better controlled suspension and better spring rates for the weight that the average person weighs, it rides smoother, it's more controlled, it just is a much more pleasurable bike to ride on and off the road because of that better suspension. Now again, I'm talking about the suspension on the R version. I haven't tested the standard version extensively enough to tell you, but I think that's going to be more comparable to the Tenere 700. When you ride the Tenere 700 off-road, there's a few things that if you're a more aggressive rider and a more experienced rider having ridden other bikes that you're going to notice. One is that it bottoms out pretty easily. The spring rates are a little bit too soft. The other thing is that the valving is not that great either. It doesn't absorb the chatter, it doesn't really isolate you from the small rocks and bumps in the way that the KTM can. So it makes a little bit more tiring, more fatiguing ride off-road, in my opinion. Simply put, you can go faster, much faster, with much more control on the KTM than you can in a T7. Up to a certain point, the T7 will keep up and you can ride it fairly aggressively, certainly more so than like a KLR or something like that. But you're just going to have a downside compared to the KTM. It just can't keep pace with the KTM's better suspension. What about fuel range? This is very important on adventure rides, and I do a lot of rides where fuel range is really important. And if you've watched some of my videos or seen my photos, you see that I carry extra fuel on the Tenere 700. I really do miss having that larger fuel tank on the 790 because I could go over 250 miles between fuel stops, where the Tenere 700 is running on fumes at around 200 miles, which just doesn't quite do it for some of the rides I like to do. Let's talk about ownership. So this is a huge part of a motorcycle, right? And this is going to get into some more difficult and more controversial things like maintenance, reliability, and resale value. So let's talk about maintenance first. The maintenance is easier and less frequent on the Yamaha. It is. So the oil change is easier. There's less to do with an oil change. You don't have the screens. You don't have multiple filters. The Tenere is easier with that. It's just one bolt and one spin on automotive filter and you're good to go. The air filter is the same on both bikes. It's under the seat, so that's similar there. Let's talk about valve clearance. So valve clearance inspections or adjustments can be a very expensive and time-consuming maintenance item if you put more miles on your bike. On the KTM, they quote an 18,000 mile interval. On the Yamaha though, you can go 26,000 miles. So that's like 50% more in the Yamaha. So if you don't want to work on your bike that much, the Yamaha overall is a better choice. They both use chain drive, so that's similar there. But yeah, that valve thing is going to be a big deal for some people. Reliability. So I normally don't talk about reliability in my videos and my bike reviews because how do you measure it? How do you really know for certain that one bike is more reliable than another? We all have our biases, we all have our stories, we all have our perceptions from what happened to yourself or your friend, but that's not scientific data, and it's really hard to prove these things, and people love to argue about it. However, with that caveat out of the way, It's no secret that the 790s and the 890s have had a lot of bugs in these first few years. Here's just a partial list of things that owners of the 790s and 890s have been reporting in pretty significant numbers. The engine cranking but not starting, failed clutches, failed rear shocks, failed brake discs, failed brake calipers, leaking countershaft seals. The oil seal there will leak oil. Coolant leaks because it's not properly connected. TFTs destroyed by water intrusion getting inside the TFT. ABS failures, and glitchy software where the software sometimes will remember your ride modes and sometimes it won't. So now, while most of those issues on the KTM are not going to probably strand you, they are very, very frustrating, and honestly, they really detract from the ownership experience. Speaking for myself, speaking for Brandon, who now has my 790 and who's gone through some of these things. There's other videos on the net about this. A lot of you watch Brett Tax. He sold his bike because of these things. It's a valid thing, like it legitimately is. It's not just made up. And if you're like more of a world traveler type, or reliability is very important to you, you don't have the time to mess with it, take it to the dealer, you don't want those little things, then the KTM may not be for you. I'm hoping that in a couple years they work a lot of these bugs, because the 890 is an incredible, incredible platform. They just need to work on their reliability a little bit. In terms of reliability on the Tenere 700, there's very little issues to report, and I've done my homework on this. You can go on the forums, you can research it yourself, but there's not many bugs that they have. It's honestly hard to find a single thing that people are complaining about from a reliability point of view in terms of mechanical stuff. So besides the price point, reliability is probably the sole reason that might sway you towards the Yamaha over the KTM. So by now, I hope this trade-off is kind of obvious. KTM is a company that has always prioritized lightweight and performance over reliability and durability. That's not a bad thing, it's just their philosophy of what they believe in, and judging by their sales, many riders would agree with that compromise. So the KTM trades off some reliability for performance and lightweight. The Yamaha makes the opposite compromise. It trades off the higher performance, the lighter weight, for more reliability, for more durability and longer lasting components. So I think when you're deciding between these bikes, there's really three factors here. The first is that reliability versus performance trade-off, and that's only a decision that only you can make. The second factor is the price. Which price suits you better? And the third thing that I never really mentioned is the styling, the aesthetics of the bike. Not even going to get into that because it's subjective. It's just your opinion. So if you like the styling of one versus the other, that's going to affect your decision. But I'm not even going to get into it because my opinion doesn't matter about that. So am I happy with the Tenere 700? Yeah, I'm really happy. It performs well enough, and I never have to worry about it being fussy. You know, when I was on this recent trip in Death Valley by myself in the middle of there, like hundreds of miles from a paved road, I just wasn't worried about it. I know it's going to start. I know it's not going to leak. It's not going to have any weird little failures out on the trail. And I love that. That's super, super valuable to me for an adventure bike. However, I do miss the added range of the 790. I miss the cruise control. I miss the quick shifter. The fact that it's faster, I don't miss that. I don't care about that part because I'm not really looking for to go super fast with my mid-size adventure bike. So the T7 is fast enough for me. I just miss some of the tech that the 790 has and that larger fuel tank. Now, are there times that I'm riding the Tenere 700 and dealing with the crappy suspension and dealing with a small fuel tank and not having the cruise and not having the quick shift? Are there times that I don't think about coming home and going to buy an 890R and using my business here, my YouTube as an excuse, right? I mean, yeah, I think about it all the time, pretty much every time I ride, but ultimately for me, I think I'm happier with the T7 just because it has that feeling of reliability, of solidity, and just not having to worry about things going wrong with it. The 890 and the 790 that preceded it, I think, is probably the most all-around capable adventure motorcycle and maybe most capable all-around motorcycle ever made. I'm really serious about that. Its range of performance from street to off-road to single track and everything in between is unparalleled in the motorcycling world. It just is, and they nailed it with that bike. If they could just improve their quality, their reliability, their ownership experience, their dealership experience, their customer service, if they could just improve those things a little bit, even like 20 or 30%, then they would have my money again and you would see my Tenere 700 for sale. But for now, I've talked long enough. I'm gonna go out and work on my bike and get back to work. So thank you guys so much for watching. I really, really appreciate you guys' support. I'm back from the hack, so we got through that. There's a few ways you can support what I'm doing here. Support me on Patreon, that's a great thing to do. Shop at Rocky Mountain for your parts and your riding gear. All the Tuss luggage that I use, all the parts I use, I list in my videos, I've shown that. You can use my link and shop there and I get a small commission which helps support the channel, so please do that. Hit the thumbs up, hit the subscribe and hit the bell, leave comments, but most of all, ride safe and stay tuned in a few days for the next video. Thank you guys, see you out there.